expand ourselves in terms of the goodness that we'll do. So I'll give you an example that comes to mind. As you know, I like to use examples that encompass, I'm seeing my two cousins there. Hi, Ezra and Joyce. I like to give examples that encompass both macro issues and micro issues. So I want to start by talking about the subject of solidarity. Obviously, solidarity is now very much in the news with the whole issue of Black Lives Matter and police interactions. So how do you express solidarity? I'm going to give two examples out of Jewish history. I remember when I was a kid, the first election, presidential election, I sort of remember following with great avidity was in 1960. I was just about 12 years old, and John Kennedy was running. And by and large, Jews who tend to vote Democratic were certainly favorably disposed towards Kennedy, but there was one issue that always troubled them, and it was not Kennedy's issue, but it was his father. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had been the ambassador to England in the period immediately preceding the World War, and it was known that he was very concerned that the British were not going to win the war, that America was going to be on a losing side, and he opposed involvement, and he opposed the very active role Jews were playing in agitating to help the Allies, and he wasn't particularly sympathetic to the British. And regarding the whole issue of anti-Semitism, this is what he declared. And I'm reading now from The Patriarch, The Remarkable Life and Turbulent Times of Joseph P. Kennedy by the highly distinguished historian David Nassau. And in an unpublished interview with a man named Joseph Dinnen, this was Kennedy's attitude on how you fight prejudices against other groups. Anti-Semitism is their fight, the Jews' fight, just as anti-Irish was my fight and the fight of my fathers. I have never discussed anti-Semitism in public because I never could see how it would be helpful. Whenever I have been asked for a statement condemning anti-Semitism, I've answered, what good would it do? If the Jews themselves would pay less attention to advertising their racial problems and more attention to solving it, the whole thing would recede into its proper perspective. It is out of focus now, and that is chiefly their fault. When you consider the backdrop of the world in which Kennedy was speaking and the amount of anti-Semitism and how much help Jews really needed, the statement comes across obviously as incredibly harsh, incredibly unfeeling. He does seem to have been, as regards other groups, a very calculating person and not a very feeling sort of person. On the other hand, I want to contrast him now with J.K. Rowling, the well-known author of the Harry Potter books. I know she's embroiled in a bit of a controversy now, but she had, over the last several years, taken a very strong stance against anti-Semitism, but her attitude is exactly the opposite of Joseph Kennedy's attitude. What was central to Kennedy's attitude? Anti-Semitism is their fight, just as anti-Irishism, as he put it, was my fight. Her point was no. To say that anti-Semitism should be the fight of the Jews and that moral non-Jews should stand aside struck her as the height of immorality. She says, why should they be left alone to fight an evil that is so pronouncedly evil? What motivated her concern was the extraordinary and what appeared to be rather sudden extreme rise in anti-Semitism under Jerome Corbyn in the Labour Party in England, till it got to a point where I think fewer than 10% of Jews ended up voting for that party. And Corbyn was, of course, basically thrown out as leader of the party, even though Jews historically, given that Jews tend to identify more as political liberals than as conservatives, they had been very attached to that party. But the party had been taken over by an anti-Semite, and they refused to discipline high members of the party who often made anti-Semitic statements until sometimes they were so extreme they had to. But Rowling kept issuing these emails and texts, and was coming out with constant statements after all. So that's what I mean by solidarity. Part of being a good person is identifying with those who are suffering and not standing aside as if it has nothing to do with you. Jews often have claimed that that's been a common feature in the non-Jewish world. There's a book I want to write. I have one book I want to write before it. God willing, I'll be spared the years to write the other. I want to write a book that, as far as I know, has never been written. Now, that's not usually the best advertisement for a book, because chances are if a book is on a subject that's never been written, maybe there really isn't sufficient interest. There are an enormous number of books written about anti-Semitism, and you could fill a library in your house, a pretty large library, with just those books. As far as I know, there is no systematic book written on philo-Semitism, on people actually who like Jews and who help Jews. And in fact, the word is so unfamiliar that many people do a double take and they don't know what the word could possibly mean. But Jewish survival has not been contingent only on Jewish efforts alone. There have often been important allies. And I didn't by any chance speak about this last week, did I? Actually, nobody could answer me. Okay, right. If you're shaking your head no, thank you, since we can't communicate directly verbally. But I'll just give you one example. The British writer George Eliot, who had a very, very major impact. She wrote a book called Daniel Deronda. If I'm not mistaken, it was Eliot's last book. And the character of Daniel Deronda is a Jew who only sort of finds out about his Jewishness in his adult years and then becomes tremendously committed. Eliot, writing well before the rise of Theodore Herzl, has Deronda going off to live in Palestine, what's then of course called Palestine, and wanting to create a Jewish state. He wants to see the Hebrew language revived. Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's a famous figure in Jewish history, a very famous figure in Jewish history, because he started the revival of the Hebrew language. He gets married, he moves to Palestine, gets married. He and his wife sort of make a pact that they're only going to speak in Hebrew. I mentioned earlier, my cousin Ezra is here. Ezra and I both went to Camp Masad, in which Eliezer ben Yehuda was a figure we always heard about, how he revives Hebrew. But according to one account, and I think it's a reliable account, ben Yehuda said the idea of reviving Hebrew and going to Israel occurred to him when he read a Russian translation of Daniel Deronda, and Deronda speaks about reviving the Hebrew language. So there have been these solid and very significant philo-Semitic figures. And I think it's going to turn out that J.K. Rowling falls into that camp. But I'll give you another example of it. In the early 1990s in Montana, we don't know how large this Aryan movement is, the Aryan Nation movement. So far, percentage-wise, it seems to represent a very small percentage of people. But how could anybody who's Jewish not watch with great anxiety and concern any rise in any such movement, certainly in the aftermath of the Holocaust? And there are like a number of states they sort of claim as their own, that they think, states that have overwhelmingly white populations, states like Montana, Idaho. And so in Montana, in a town called Billings, Montana, in 1992, there was something like 60 Jewish families. And one family, their name was Schnitzer, pretty Jewish sounding name, had their Hanukkah menorah on their window, as many Jews do. And a local racist threw a brick through their window. The brick shattered and the room that the menorah was in was the room where their young son Isaac lived. Fortunately, he was not injured, though a lot of glass was shattered. The glass all basically fell on his bed. And he obviously ran out of the room, scared out of his wits, or he had seen them before. And then I'm forgetting now the exact details, but what I'm saying is the essential truth. It shattered the window and the glass spilled onto his bed. And the Schnitzers were obviously very concerned. They called the police. One of the police who came said to them, listen, until your holiday passes, don't display any Jewish symbols. And the woman related it to a number of her non-Jewish friends. One of her non-Jewish friends was the member of a church, and she went to her minister and she said, could you imagine what it would be like for me if I had to live in a society where there was an attack on our house because we had a Christmas tree and I had to explain to my children, we have to basically hide the Christmas tree? He said, this is totally unacceptable. And the minister launched a campaign in conjunction with the Billings newspaper where they printed a giant printout of a Hanukkah menorah. And the estimates are that between 3,000 and 6,000 people put their menorah in their windows. That's again what I mean by a real act of solidarity. By the way, it's not that none of them paid a price. The local neo-Nazis actually broke a few more windows of other people and have not been eradicated as a group, but it dealt a very, very strong blow. And the Jews, who had been a very small group, obviously felt much more defended and embraced. So solidarity indicates that you identify with the whole of humanity. It's what I understand in large measure is the meaning of the biblical story of Genesis, which is that humanity descends from one couple. Now, people might have their scientific issues, but it obviously conveys a very important lesson. And the Talmud draws out that lesson. He says, "Lefichach nivra Adam yichidi," therefore Adam was created as a singular creature. And then, of course, Eve gets created to teach us that all of humanity descend from one couple, and therefore we are all in one way or another interrelated. And no one can say, I come from a more distinguished ancestry than you, because we all really come from the same ancestry. Interestingly, the concept of racism, I'm sure in one form or another, has long, long existed, but it gets a sort of scientific basis in Germany in the 19th century with writers like de Gobineau and others. And when people, sometimes, I remember when I was living in Israel in the mid-1980s, and for a variety of reasons, I came back to the United States, basically because I met my wife, who was living here in the United States and who was not in a position to move then. But I remember Israelis would sometimes say to me, you American Jews are naive. The Jews in Europe also thought that they were accepted members. Look at how naive the Jews of Germany were. And the answer I used to give them, and I hope this answer remains true deep into the future, I'm a little nervous about it now, but the answer I used to give them was, even when Jews were accepted with equal rights in Europe, Judaism, the religion, never had any status. The common expression among emancipated Jews in Europe was be a Jew at home and a mensch and a human being in the street. So the idea was certainly, and to this day it remains, so certainly a Jew would not wear a kippah or do identifiably Jewish things. I said the difference in the United States was the United States became the first society, and this was a gradual process, I'm not being naive, but it was a gradual process in which Judaism also acquired a certain amount of status. Ironically, the example I always give, the first Jew who was nominated on a national party ticket, Joe Lieberman, it was actually considered an asset that he was a religiously observant Jew. I remember in 1964, I was a teenager when Barry Goldwater got the Republican nomination, and the Jewish writer Harry Golden said, "I always knew the first Jew to be nominated for president would be an Episcopalian." Goldwater actually was not halachically Jewish, but his family name was Goldwasser, and I think his grandfather had converted out, possibly his father, and he was certainly not a self-hating Jew. But he was obviously not Jewish, and in no way identified as such. Had somebody said to us in 1964, by the way, in the year 2000, can I be seen clearly? Or is my head going in and out? I don't know what I'm supposed to do exactly. I don't want to be with a bent over back. What about now? Is that any better? I know people are motioning to me what to do.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you. It's always nice to be reassured that I'm good. Okay. Anyway, so I remember had somebody predicted to us in 1964 that a Jew would be nominated on a national party ticket, and it would and he wouldn't campaign on the Sabbath. It would have sounded so patently ridiculous to us, because we thought that Jews who rose high in politics, by and large, were Jews we used to call like 3 days a year. They would go to services, let's say, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, and would attend a Seder. It never would have occurred to us that a religiously committed Jew, but actually it can gain someone a certain amount of status. So this was the case, and I have no idea why I got off into that digression. Anyway, but in Billings, Montana, so all of a sudden, a lot of people identified with the Jews over this Hanukkah issue, and you had thousands of households in which people put up a menorah to show their sense of identification with the Jewish community. And again, this is moral imagination. So what can we do, or what should we do, or what ideas do people have, how we show identification for another group, or another, or a group even within people? I remember when they had the attacks on the Hasidim in Crown Heights, there were certain Jewish groups that didn't really react to it. And A.M. Rosenthal, who at that point I think was the former editor of the New York Times, said, "You're a Jew, and the anti-Semites who make these attacks see you as a Jew. You might think that they see these people as Hasidim and not the same as you, but they're going to see you the same way." So there's also a self-interest in identifying with the community. And it's been one of the things historically that has often moved people about Jews, that they do care about what happens to Jews in other countries. So it's a question also, therefore, again, of the moral imagination. I'll give you another example, which has nothing to do with Hasidim. I was reading a memoir by a journalist, a pretty well-known journalist named David Gregory. How many of you recall the name? You can nod your heads if you do. David was the NBC news correspondent assigned to the White House during George W. Bush's administration, and later on he was the host of Meet the Press. And David, in midlife, he was a child of an intermarriage, but had always been raised that had a bar mitzvah. His Jewish identity was not particularly a dominant feature in his life, but as he was getting older, it started to become more and more significant to him. And I came to know, I was actually not familiar with him. I got a phone call from him one day. He said, "I'm reading your book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, and it's affecting the way I'm reporting the presidential race and political races," because the book was about Lashon Hara and how do you speak fairly about people. And so his Jewishness became important. He fell in love with his wife, who was not Jewish, who actually was her Christianity mattered to her. He had been covering a story. She was either the lead prosecutor or one of the prosecutors in the Timothy McVeigh case, the Oklahoma City bombing. And she was at ease and open. It was not an easy thing for her, but feeling that the best thing was for their children to have one religious tradition. So she assented to the children being raised as Jews, because it's problematic when kids are raised in two religions. It can lead to issues. Are they identifying with one parent more than with the other parent? And it's confusing. Christianity and Judaism definitely have similarities, but they just as definitely have very, strong differences. But he told me of an imaginative act that occurs every year in the synagogue they go to. It's a Reform synagogue that they go to for the high holidays together. And I mean, he goes to synagogue more often, but she comes with him on the high holidays. And in the middle of the Yom Kippur service, the rabbi asks all non-Jews in the congregation, which means all non-Jews, usually it means who are married to Jews, but who did not convert to Judaism, which is a common case, who have agreed to raise the children as Jewish, please come up to the center of the synagogue. And he then offers a very special prayer for them, for these people who have been so allied with the Jewish community and who are raising the children to continue Jewish life. And David Gregory told me, and he's written about it. If he had just told it to me as something, privately, obviously I wouldn't share it in public. But he told me that his wife is always moved to tears by this, and that because it's a recognition, this was not such an easy thing for her to do. It's not just a throwaway thing. She did have to give up some of what would have made her more comfortable. And yet she wanted to show her solidarity, and we have to show our gratitude. Gratitude really is the prerequisite trait for being a decent human being. It's impossible to be a decent person if you're an ingrate, but it's also, interestingly enough, the prerequisite trait for being a happy person. I have literally in my life never met somebody who struck me as an ingrate, but who otherwise seemed to be a happy person. Because what's the mindset of a grateful person? Look what so-and-so did for me. He really likes me. Look how she spoke up in my behalf. She really loves me. At the very moment you cultivate gratitude, you're also cultivating a feeling of being loved. Conversely, what's the mindset of an ungrateful person? Oh yeah, I know he helped me. Yeah, now he's going to expect me to do something for him. Oh yeah, I know. Yeah, she said it. Now who knows what she's going to want me to do for her. What an ungrateful person reveals about themselves is how unloved they feel. Ungrateful people live in a loveless world in which people only do things out of some pragmatic notion how it's going to then be good for them. And that's why such people really can't be happy. And it's certainly not pleasant to be around such people, and they're not ethical. They're not ethical because it's not fair. If you're going to remember every bad thing somebody did, well, then also remember some of the good things they did. You can show me by a nodding a head or not. Did I speak last week about this notion of gratitude and how it helps, and speak about Adam Grant, who wrote a book called Give and Take? I can't tell. Do me a favor, raise your right hand if I did speak about it. Okay, so I won't speak about it again. The interesting insight that Grant had, that if you're going to give a time, money, attention, give it to people who are either themselves generous. Money might not be as much a factor, they might not need it. But a time and attention, and really extend yourself to people who are themselves givers, or at least matchers, who will do for others what others do for them. If you consistently find yourself giving to takers, you will consistently find yourself taken advantage of. So anyway, so the issue of gratitude, and that's why it was very moving to Gregory and to his wife. I want to speak on an emotion that in some ways might not be the opposite of gratitude, but it's an emotion that has the capacity to cause as much misery as gratitude, can cause pleasure, and that is the emotion of anger. Anger is not always an inappropriate emotion. In fact, Maimonides, in a famous passage, says nobody should ever train themselves to never get angry, because a person who never gets angry and never can be aroused to anger is basically like a corpse, so totally devoid of feeling. But on the other hand, anger needs to be a carefully measured and watched emotion, because the truth is most people get angry about personal matters. As much as you might dislike certain political or other leaders, there's a good chance that the things that get you actually the angriest are some slight somebody might have done to you. And you can often do great harm within your relationships. I have found that in many families I know, there are people who are not on speaking terms. And I know how heartbreaking that would be for the matriarchs and patriarchs of the family. I have 4 children. If God forbid that they ever, and thank God they are all on very good terms. If God forbid I ever found out that 2 of my children were not on speaking terms, it would actually be devastating to me. I sometimes say it because as a rabbi, I've had occasion obviously to perform funerals and others, and sometimes there are siblings who hate each other, aren't talking. And if I have sufficient closeness with them, I'll say I can probably not think of a grosser disrespect and violation of the 5th commandment to honor your father and mother than to do what you're doing. It would be devastating to your parents if they knew that 2 of their siblings, that 2 of their children were not on speaking terms. Anyway, interestingly, a real depiction of anger in the Bible occurs in the book of Kings. The Bible is very cognizant of romantic love. Isaac loved Rebekah, Jacob, as is very detailed, loved Rachel. But as probably befits a book that was written during a very patriarchal period of history, love is almost always described from the male's perspective, as is in the examples that I just gave. There is only one woman in the Bible whose love for a man is recorded. And if we were doing this all live and everybody could talk, I'd ask if anybody knows. Just by a showing of hands, does anybody know who it is? Which woman in the Bible's love for a man is recorded? She's not a very well-known biblical figure, but she's not an obscure figure either. It's a woman named Michal. Michal is the daughter of King David, and Michal is the daughter of King Saul. And Michal loved David. Saul at first also loved David, but then his love turned to hatred because David was the one who killed Goliath, and he then became the great hero of the women of Israel, and Saul grew to hate him very much so. But twice we're told that Michal loved David. So here we think we're going to come across a biblical marriage that's going to be really a happy one. It turned out to be very unhappy. And the unhappiness erupts into a terrible fight on what should have been the happiest day in David's kingship. The Philistines had taken away the Ark of the Lord from Israel. The Ark of the Lord contained the 10 Commandments. If the Ark of the Lord was ever found, it would eclipse by a factor of 10 in significance all other archaeological finds. But anyway, so the Ark of the Lord had been lost to the Israelites, and it's then recovered during the times of David, and David leads the people in a wild dance. The biblical text says, and if you want to look it up in the Bible, it's actually there. This is not midrashic. This is not rabbinic imaginations of what might have happened, the fleshing out of the story. This is taka. This is in the story itself. So it's in the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 6. So in the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 6, it records that Michal, herself the daughter of a king, so she came from a very distinguished royal ancestry, was looking out and saw David dancing wildly with the people, and she condemned him. She had contempt for him. Maybe she thought that it lowered the dignity of the kingship to be carrying on like one of the commoners. And indeed, when David came home that night from the party, Michal greeted him with real words of scorn. You really brought honor upon yourself, dancing with the riffraff like one of the riffraff yourself. We know the expression in English to rain on someone's parade. Well, this was his very happy day, and to attack him like that really hurt him. And he did what many people do when they're hurt. He wanted to hurt her back. So he said to her, yes, it's true that I danced like one of the riffraff with the riffraff to honor God, because it is God who chose me to be king over Israel instead of your father and your brothers. This was said a short time after Michal's father Saul and 3 of her brothers had been killed in battle against the Philistines. The next verse in the text records, and Michal till her dying day had no children. So some of the Bible commentators, when Bible commentators like you can get away with a lot. When Bible commentators don't like you can get away with nothing. So like if you actually read the biblical text itself, Esau, Jacob's brother, doesn't seem like such a terrible guy. He seems more like sort of like a jock who was not super smart. He certainly, though, had a love for his father and other things. But in the rabbinic midrash, he's depicted very, very badly. David comes out as the hero in everything. And, they make the point, maybe Michal did not have children because she had spoken so badly to David. But the truth is, what Michal said to David was obnoxious, and what David said to her was cruel. It was obnoxious to say you danced like one of the riffraff, and it's cruel to say God chose me instead of your murdered father and murdered brothers. But the next verse records, and Michal till her dying day had no children. I would suggest that the reason was, after such a fight, they might never again have been intimate. Every year, among the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of divorces that take place in the United States, there are divorces among people who had at some point genuinely loved each other. But words, when not chosen carefully, can cause such pain that love can actually be destroyed. Now, it's unlikely it'll be destroyed by just one outburst, even though certain types of outbursts should be avoided at all costs. But you have a sneaking suspicion when you read about that fight between David and Michal that might not have been the only time in their lives that they exchanged cruel words. And so even when angry, people have to watch their language. I would go further. Specifically when they're angry, you have to watch it, because you need to learn that once words are expressed, they can do a great deal of damage. And there's a reason for it, and it's not a fair reason, but it is a reason. People tend to believe that what somebody says when they're angry is what they truly feel. Now, it's true. What people say when they're angry is what they truly feel at that moment. All of us have had feelings of anger towards somebody, even on the same day that we had much more positive feelings. And yet, once they're expressed, it's always in the mind of the other person. Words cannot really be ever taken back. And there is one tool that I can suggest to people that and how many of your families, if I may ask, this is by a showing of hands, are there relatives who are not on speaking terms? Okay, about half, I don't know what it looks like there, but of the 20 or so that I can see you on my screen, more than half, actually, the hands went up. Usually what happened was during a fight, nobody can hurt you as much as somebody who knows you very well. You know, in other words, if I'm walking down the street, a stranger can say something that'll frighten me or that'll offend me, but he doesn't know me well enough to really, really, truly hurt me. But somebody who knows you well can know exactly what will be most hurtful to you. And so what's my one guideline to avoid saying anything, no matter how angry you ever get at another person, is this: restrict the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it. If somebody did something that really angered you and provoked you to anger, even if you talk about it a little too much, at least the other person can absorb it and not feel that your anger represents the entirety of your emotions and assessment of them. But if you start dredging into the past, if you use words like always or never, you're always inconsiderate, you never think before you act, what's the other person supposed to do? Oh, you're right, I am always inconsiderate. Or, yes, I am exceptionally stupid, I never think before I act. They have to so efface themselves and humiliate themselves. So instead, they're not going to do that. What they'll end up doing is starting to recall all the annoying, ugly things that you've possibly done. That's why it is so bad when people do that. If you can abide by this one rule, have I in my own life tried to abide by this rule for many years? I have. Have I succeeded? Almost always. And any time I've ever broken this rule, and as far as I know, I've not broken it in at least the last 10 years, any time I have ever broken that rule, I have deeply, deeply, deeply regretted it. I have inflicted a hurt that was so beyond what I had any right to do, even though I thought the other person had done something wrong. But it would be like decreeing capital punishment for every offense. You can't do it. You can't attack people in that way. This will enable your life to proceed much more smoothly. The other corrective we have for it is, of course, apologies. But the important thing with apologies is that when you apologize, you have to accept full responsibility for the act. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. One is a story I've had occasion to tell in the past. It was an apology story that actually is somewhat humorous, but when my two daughters, I have 3 daughters and a son, when 2 of my daughters, Naomi and Shira, were 6 and 4, we were living for 2 years in Boulder, Colorado. And I was speaking actually at a Jewish community center at the JCC in Denver, which was less than an hour's drive away. And the girls both said they wanted to go to my speech. They said, "Daddy, we know you travel around. We know you give speeches. We'd like to come." I knew the speech was going to be over their heads and that it would be boring at a certain point to them. I discouraged them, but they said, no, we really want to come. So they come with me. Happily, that day was a pretty large crowd. I think it was probably around 300 people. And I'm a very proud father. So I introduced Naomi. I introduced Shira. Everybody applauds and they sit down in the front row. About 10 minutes into the speech, I asked the audience, how many of you grew up in a household where somebody's bad temper had a bad effect on the house? Among the hands that go up are Naomi and Shira. As you can imagine, having the girls there actually raising their hands, people were laughing hysterically. I, of course, was quite embarrassed. Finally, I came back with the only comeback line I could. I said, unfortunately, my wife has a terrible temper. But in any case, it was a funny incident, but obviously it was a little troubling. What had been going on was Naomi was 6, and we had enrolled her in a local school that wasn't quite meeting our expectations, so I was teaching her how to read. And according to my wife, I am very patient the first time I explain something to somebody. And according to my wife, I'm very patient the second time I explain something to somebody. And according to my wife, by the third time, I could become a little snappy. So I was snapping a little I was snapping a little at Naomi, and obviously, it had bothered her. So after the speech, I went over to Naomi and I said to her, you know what, when you make a mistake, you're not making it to be bad. You're making a mistake. I make mistakes. And for me to get angry at you is very inappropriate. And I want to really ask you to forgive me. And if I do it again in the future, I want you to say to me, Daddy, you're not supposed to do that. Which, by the way, she really did start saying it. It was very irritating. But in any case, so, it had an effect. But I was thinking about it later. Could you imagine if I had said to Naomi, instead of offering a full-throated apology, if I had instead said to Naomi, Naomi, when you make a mistake, you're not doing it intentionally, and it's wrong for me to get angry like that. So I apologize. But you have to admit that when you keep making a mistake over and over, it is pretty irritating. It would take away the full force of the apology. I'll give you another interesting example. The first Jew, obviously, who was ever appointed to the American Supreme Court was Louis Brandeis. And, for many decades, appointments to the court were quite routine. Today, we assume it's become highly politicized between Democrats and Republicans and over certain issues. So today we assume that almost no Supreme Court nomination is going to go through, with an overwhelming vote. There's going to be serious opposition, and somebody's going to win by a majority, but not a supermajority. That tended to be true throughout most of American history. But Brandeis's nomination really did provoke a lot of opposition, and he ended up getting appointed, but I think it was like one of those like 60-40 votes, something, in that sphere. And people were less self-conscious in those days about acknowledging that they were anti-Semites. I mean, most distinguished people would not say I'm a Jew hater, but they would not refrain from calling out and naming the Jewishness of someone they opposed. And so 6 former presidents of the American Bar Association wrote a letter opposing Brandeis's nomination and why he would be unfit. And they made reference to his Jewishness and having a different sense about justice than Christians would and other things. A 7th major figure who opposed it was William Howard Taft, who was a former president of the United States and who really was not an anti-Semite, but who really did this and disassociated himself from the anti-Semites, but really disliked Brandeis. He said he's a corrupt person. He thinks in non-judicial terms. He went on and on like that. And it didn't end up, surprisingly enough, Brandeis really was confirmed to the court. A couple of years later, Brandeis used to take a walk around, he used to take a walk in the early evenings in Washington, and he actually, strangely enough, bumped into Taft. It's not that hard to bump in. Taft was a very big man. But in any case, they came across each other, and Taft looked at Brandeis and he said, Mr. Justice Brandeis, a number of years ago, I did you a terrible wrong, and I apologize. And subsequently, another unusual thing happened. Taft has an unusual distinction. He's the only former president who was then appointed to serve on the Supreme Court, and he was appointed to be Chief Justice. And he and Brandeis became really quite friendly. And there's a letter in Taft's archives that he wrote to his daughter, in which he writes, Brandeis and I have marked political differences, but I have come to like him so much. But again, it goes back to that apology. Brandeis, first of all, I don't know how Brandeis would have reacted to Taft's apology if Taft had actually been successful in keeping him off the court. It's like they always point to how gracious Joseph was to his brothers when they apologized and begged for forgiveness. But it was probably a little easier for Joseph to be gracious when he was this number 2 person in all of Egypt. If they had found Joseph and he had lived his whole life as a slave and been maltreated, I don't know if he could have so easily, I doubt that he could have so easily forgiven them. So Brandeis was serving on the court. but there really was developed a mutuality of respect and friendship that would not have developed, I don't think, if Taft had not been so forthright in accepting responsibility. If he instead had said to Brandeis, you know, that letter I wrote was excessive, but you really had some very provocative political views that were very disturbing. Had he said that, I don't think there could have been that same level of reconciliation. I think when you apologize, if you want the apology to work, you have to accept full responsibility. The good thing about doing that is it then makes it easier for the other person to say, well, I also did some wrong things. Whereas if you keep in your shtuch, if you keep in your critique, the other person's going to start getting defensive, as I think would be very common for all of us to do. I'm just going to go on to point out another couple of instances of moral imagination, people doing things where they couldn't do. So here, I'm going to give one that I wrote about some years ago in my book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. I'll read it to you. Moral imagination can be exercised by children no less than by adults. Ian O'Gorman, this was an incident that happened around 1990, a 10-year-old boy in Oceanside, California, was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors prescribed 10 weeks of chemotherapy, during which they warned him all of his hair would fall out. To avoid the anxiety and pain of watching his hair disappear, the youngster had his entire head shaved. One can only imagine Ian's feelings a few days later when he returned to school, prematurely bald, and was greeted by the 13 other boys in his 5th grade class and their teacher as well, with all their heads completely shaved. What an eloquent statement of empathy. When the desire to ease someone else's pain is sufficiently deep, one can almost always find words or deeds that make a difference. So that's what I'm saying. If we open up the full resources of our hearts and our intellect, it's amazing what you do. And one comment now about Lashon Hara, which I've written about quite a bit in my life, speaking unfairly of others, and to watch one's words. I want to mention a couple of statements by Israel Salanter. Salanter was an extraordinary rabbinic figure. He lived his entire life in the 19th century. If I remember, I think he lived from 1810 to 1883. And he wanted to put primary emphasis on the moral teachings of Judaism, and many of them which were being violated. And he always thought, though, in ethical terms. So, for example, he was once invited to a Friday night Shabbat dinner at a certain man's house. The man was known to be, an observant Jew and a friendly host, and to have a very nice Friday night Shabbat table, a table where people around the table would sing Shabbat Zmirot, Sabbath songs. They would have a discussion of the Torah reading, and it was altogether a very pleasant experience. Salanter asked the man, he said, I will gladly come, but I have 2 conditions. There be no singing of Shabbat songs. And what were the 2 things I just said? And there will be no discussion of the Torah during the meal. The man, as you can imagine, was taken aback, but he wanted to host Israel Salanter, so of course he agreed. Salanter comes, and as the meal is drawing to a close, the host asks him, why did he impose these very strange conditions? And so Salanter said, there's been a cook working in the kitchen, please bring her out, I need to say something to her. So the woman comes out, and he says to her, I need to apologize to you. I'm sorry at the undue strain I put on you by having the meal all served consecutively without any breaks during the meal. And she said to him, Rabbi, there's nothing to apologize for. This is the first Shabbat I can remember where I'm actually going to go home at a decent hour, where it's not that late. She leaves, and Salanter says, "That's why I made that request." And then, of course, then the meal is sort of ended. You know what? I'll quiet for a minute. I think you can all hear there are fire trucks passing. So he thought, again, in creative terms. On one occasion, many of you are probably familiar with the custom that in observant households, before you eat bread, you're supposed to wash your hands. And, you know, many Jews do it. Some do it only at the Sabbath table. And Salanter, though, and you're supposed to actually, the Talmud says you should pour copious amounts. When's the last time anybody of you ever heard the word copious used? You're supposed to, you know, generously water your hands. Salanter, though, would use minimal amounts of water. And he was asked about that. He said, we don't have, you know, in those days, they didn't have running water. Somebody had to bring the water up. They would go down and get water out of a well and bring it up. He says, I'm not doing it on that person's shoulders. So he would do the minimal amount that was required. In speaking about Lashon Hara, he made a very interesting observation. He said, if you say of a rabbi that he can sing, and of a cantor that he can't really study Torah, that's Lashon Hara. But if you say of a rabbi that he can't study Torah, and of a cantor that he can't sing, that's more like murder. So when we pass on opinions about others, or we pass on rumors that we've heard, we got to think through what is the capacity of that rumor and comment to do in terms of damaging somebody. I know a woman who very recently said something extraordinarily hurtful to somebody very dear to me, and then later on, you know, realized it was a disgusting comment, and she realized it. And she's far from being the worst person I know. She's actually a person who thinks she's quite a good person. But then she has to then ask herself, if she can't learn anything from that event, then it becomes a truly hopeless situation. What suddenly inspired her to say something, to word a critique in such a mean manner? And I remember I was once reading something that Rebecca Goldstein wrote. Rebecca Goldstein is a novelist philosopher, and she was famous for a book she wrote called The Mind-Body Problem. She also teaches philosophy. She also won, I'm forgetting the name, what's the famous like Genius Award? The MacArthur?
Yeah, MacArthur.
Okay, MacArthur. She's a recipient of a MacArthur Award. She writes that when her book, The Mind-Body Problem, came out, she was still quite a young woman, and it was a big deal, and it was an important book. And there was one devastatingly negative review that was written of it that always haunted her and bothered her. And many years later, she met the author of that review. And he said to her, he actually somewhat apologized. He said, your book was getting such extraordinary acclaim, and I was a young writer just starting out, and I wanted to make a name for myself. So I wanted to be the person who exposed that this book was not really so important and good. And she said she looked at the man in horror. She said, do you know how much effort a person goes into writing a book? And all you wanted to do was to cut it down to improve your own name? Which is why it's interesting. I do not review books. I will only, or I'll tell them in advance, I'll only write something that's positive about a book. I'll only give a negative review to a book if I think the author had malicious intentions or did something evil in it. I mean, if I had to review a book, I'll take an example where you'll understand what I'm saying. By Noam Chomsky, who once wrote a book in which Hitler's name was mentioned 12 times, all of which to show that Israel was pursuing policies like his. But otherwise I wouldn't do it. I was sent a book recently, asked by a major journal to review it. And I happen to know that this author was very popular. It was a book on the Bible, and a lot of people really, really liked her. For some reason, her style has never attracted me. And the last thing I would want to do is write a negative review of the book. Just because it's not a style that's attractive to me doesn't give me the right to do something that could damage somebody else. I want to maybe finish. Oh, wow. Yes. I started a little late, so I went a little late. But one last story that takes us back to the subject of solidarity. And it's a beautiful story. And in one way or another, it could apply to many of us in one situation or another. I have a close friend in LA, a man named Steve Marmer. Steve is a psychiatrist. He also has a private practice, and he also teaches at the UCLA Medical School. And he told me about an incident that happened with him when he was a medical student. And there's a section of, about standing up and speaking up. Sometimes harsh words are blessed words. The famous words that were attributed to Ford Frick when he heard rumors that the St. Louis Cardinals were planning to sit out a game with Jackie Robinson to protest because they didn't want there to be a black player in the playing baseball. And, and they had, earlier the baseball commissioner, the judge, Kennesaw Landis, had kept blacks out with the most fatuous, stupid statement to the fact blacks like playing in their own league. Yeah, they like playing in their own league, and they probably also like getting terribly underpaid, which obviously they did. So anyway, according to the story as it was reported in the papers, which might have exaggerated a bit, but basically Frick said to them as follows: if you do this, carry out your strike, you will be suspended from the league. You will find that the friends you think you have in the press will not support you. You will be outcasts. I don't care if half the league strikes. Those who do will encounter quick retribution. I don't care if it wrecks the National League for 5 years. This is the United States, and one citizen has as much right to play as another. The National League will go down the line with Robinson. You will find that if you go through with your intention, you will have been guilty of madness. And it did diffuse the whole situation. There's been an argument to this day how far along their plans were, but we know. And interestingly, one of the Dodger players, he was a big Dodger favorite, Dixie Walker. I'm conscious if I make any errors, my beloved cousin, who knows far more about baseball than I do, will know. So I'm watching his face. But Dixie Walker asked apparently to be traded because he didn't want to play on the team with Robinson. And, it's traditional, of course, when a player hits a home run, the player who's in the box, shakes his hand, and he didn't do so. But in an interview with Walker many years later, he writes that was the stupidest thing he had ever done in his life. So part of moral imagination is to think through in the future, what do you wish you had done? And in the future, what do you wish you didn't then do? I remember I was once reading, there was a woman who had a radio talk show, a controversial figure, Laura Schlesinger. But I remember once I knew her, and she told me she got a call from a guy whose sister and brother-in-law had been killed in a car accident, and he was the only really relative who was around to raise the two children who had remained. I think it was two young girls or something. And he called up Laura Schlesinger, and he says, I don't know what to do. He said, my whole social life has evaporated. Every penny I earn, is going to support them. Part of me is tempted to put them up for adoption or to put them into, some sort of a home where they can be cared for. And I don't know how to make a decision. And she said to him, project yourself 15 years into the future and think, what decision do you wish you had made? And obviously he chose to keep them. Anyway, so So Steve was in a class and he describes what happened. And I'll finish with this note. When I was a second-year student, during one particular lecture, a student rose to ask a very elementary question. This was, of course, already in medical school. The teacher glared at him and actually said, "That is a stupid question." The red-faced student sat down, but another student, one of the best in the class, raised his hand. Expecting a more intelligent comment, the teacher recognized him. The second student said, "Professor, none of us in this class is stupid. We may be ignorant and we're here to learn. You should apologize to so-and-so and to the class." At that point, all the other students applauded. To his credit, the professor did offer an apology before continuing his lecture. He even thanked the student. This incident, Steve told me, was formative in his own life. I have never forgotten how morally courageous that was for my classmate to do. There are times in life when we're presented with a unique challenge, and if we get it right the first time, we'll feel a lot better about ourselves. And if we don't get it right the first time, we'll feel bad, but at least that can goad us to act differently if it happens a second time. Thank you very much, and I'm open if anybody has any questions. And I want to reiterate what I said. Thank you. I'm getting some nice responses there. And I want to reiterate what I said last time. I'm at jtelushkin@aol.com. If any of you have instances of moral imagination that you've done or that you know that others have done, I'd be most appreciative if you sent it to me. Anyway, thank you. Shalom.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Telushkin. Thank you, everyone, for coming.